My name is Sabine Pahl. I'm a professor of environmental psychology at the University of Vienna. In this video, we will look at behavior and behavior change from individual to social to societal level. And this is important because all environmental problems are determined by humans to some extent, and we need humans to solve it. And we'll look at this from an interdisciplinary point of view. Let's start by thinking about behavior that's relevant for the environmental context. What sort of behaviors spring to mind? What people typically mention first is recycling. Then perhaps diet, flying in a plane. They're all good examples. What else is there? If we broaden out flying, it's about mobility choices in general. Not just for longer trips for work and pleasure, where you might consider flying, but also everyday mobility. Do people drive a car? What kind of car is this? Do they live car-free? To some degree, it is up to individual choice. We have people in the same context, same block of flats, where one family drives a huge petrol car, another drives a small electric car, and a third family moves around using cargo bikes or similar. Then there's the question of how and where you live. The classic single-family home with a garden or a shared space, e.g. a flat in a large apartment block. These have very different environmental footprints. A third example is about products and adoption of environmentally friendly technology. Do you get a new phone every year? Do you keep your old one until it falls apart? Would you invest in solar panels if you had the chance? Would you do it even without incentives? Again, these decisions are to some degree under individual control, driven by preferences, motivations, emotions, or the classic psychological drivers. But also infrastructure plays a role. There are some other examples that people often don't immediately think about. Investment, financial decisions. Voting has a huge influence on what happens next. Energy communities is an example where communities come together to generate their own energy. And protesting, collective action. These are also behaviors that have a big environmental impact and bring people together. They're more citizenship behaviors, collective behaviors, not just a single individual on its own making decisions. So what I get asked most of all, perhaps, is, so what should I do? People say, I'm worried about climate change, but I have no idea if anything I do makes a difference, really. They also say that it's incredibly confusing because you get such different information from different places. So there is research that tries to quantify the impact of different actions as a starting point for people. This is a really difficult task because you can't necessarily compare actions directly. Depends on the multitude of factors and on the context someone is in, but it's a starting point. Here's the core figure from their work. They use 3 categories of actions: avoid, shift, and improve. Not sure they are that clear-cut, but let's go with this. What can you see? First of all, there is quite a lot of variance. The data range enormously. They summarize many different studies, and of course, the studies don't say exactly the same. But if we look at the top options, the actions that have the most carbon potential, they are living car-free, so avoiding car ownership, and avoiding one long-distance flight makes a big difference. Then the shift to public transport and the shift to a vegan diet make a big difference. And then finally, in the third category for improving, the top one is having a battery electric vehicle, if you have a car. Caution here, the data vary a lot. It depends a lot on additional things, such as how big the car is, where the electricity comes from that goes into the car. It's not so straightforward. Then there's renewable energy, renewable electricity as the next big thing you can do. And then 2 actions to do with housing, refurbishment and renovation. So improving the housing envelope, windows, adding insulation, and finally heat pumps. In some, it is a mix of actions you can adopt. Some are quite easily in your everyday life done, and other actions that are harder, require considerable investment or ownership, control over your house where you live. In any case, this is one of the very few studies that actually try to compare options on the basis of a really good amount of evidence. So hopefully you have some ideas what has more or less impact. And there are some options for behavior change. Here summarized again as questions. How do we move us and our things? And also, do we need quite so many things? Reducing consumption is a big topic as well. You think of fast fashion, the mobile phone every year. Then what do we eat? Diet is a big topic. How do we live and how do we share? Models of shared ownership, car sharing, appliances sharing are important topics here. So this is a session about behavior change. And so far, I've emphasized the individual decisions a little more, but I've also already pointed out how this is embedded in a social context. There's a lot of research on social norms, social influence, but there are also other layers of society. This is illustrated here and is a core topic of environmental psychology, the interactions between people and environments. So there is the individual level, each of us with their attitudes, motivations, values, their personality and experiences, many important characteristics. Then there's the social or community level. This includes people who are really close to us, perhaps family, but also not so close. It matters what they think and how they react to our suggestions and intentions before we even act. Think about a family who goes traditionally to Gran Canaria on holidays and one family member decides they don't want to fly anymore. Think about the discussions these people have. Around that are layers of materials and technology available to us. We don't have so much influence on this directly because industry and other market and regulation aspects drive this. And that's the final layer. The regulation and policy landscape around us determines the range of options. All of these work together to determine behavior in a city, in a country, and globally. For example, I'm part of a group of scientists who work with the United Nations on the Global Plastics Treaty. That is intended to set the context for a global treaty, but member states have to agree first of all. They have to make up their mind. Then it needs to be implemented into national or regional regulation and other measures, which then hopefully have the desired effect. Behavior is embedded and constrained by rules, systems, and infrastructure, but it's not an either-or question. At least in a democracy, people can influence those things by voting. They can also engage for change locally and regionally and in communities. Here's another way of looking at this. My colleague Ilona Otto talks about agency at different levels and uses two different dimensions: individual to collective and everyday to strategic political. 4 examples for each of those quadrants: for individual and everyday, for example, consumer choices; for individual and strategic political, voting is a good example; for collective and everyday, it's consumer boycotts. People get together to say we don't buy this anymore. And for collective and strategic political, a good example is protests, collective action. Here's an example from my sphere of research to illustrate this system of change options, plastic pollution. And the integration of perspectives and disciplines is hugely important when addressing complex environmental issues such as plastic pollution. Plastic is a system. The problem actually started with environmental scientists discovering plastics and microplastics in the natural environment, specifically on the coast and in the ocean. And this then drove research on the sources and the pathways. People ask, where does this come from? Then the question turned to drivers of this. Why do we have this in the environment? Where does it come from? What are the drivers? And how can we change this? So different approaches, a toolbox of initiatives, regulation, incentives, and taxes is needed. But what we pointed out from a social behavioral science point of view is that humans are the sole cause of plastic pollution and also the drivers of solutions. So the decisions and actions are of core importance, not just the general public or different publics, but actors at all levels and in different contexts, from the producers who make decisions about materials to use, to people managing waste, to investors giving money for materials and for products and for cleanup, and of course society in the middle with their different behavioral options. And it's really important that we think about this as a system. Originally, the focus was very much on the end of the pipe, cleanup of whatever ends up in the wrong place. Now, increasingly, the focus is on circular systems and upstream solutions, different materials, different products, systems such as reuse, and really thinking about these different elements coming together. So if we stay with the decisions and behaviors, what are some of the factors that have been shown to predict behavior change? Start with the psychology here. Very broadly, important factors are attitudes, concern, but also identity. Who do I think I am drives the decisions I make. Values are important. Emotions are perhaps surprisingly important drivers of behavior. People feel in a certain way. In the plastic context, people have very strong emotional responses, moral responses, that it's just wrong to have the artificial material in the natural environments. They don't want it there. Social norms are important, and knowledge contributes, but it's not really a strong motivator, a strong driver of behavior. Knowledge doesn't have that motivational power. And finally, embedding this back into an integrated model. So the psychological factors I've just talked about sit in the middle. They're divided into motivational factors, capability, and opportunity. Then there are principles of behavior change around the central part, for example, education and training, but also restrictions, incentives, so reflecting intrinsic and extrinsic motivation. And on the outside, you find more structural aspects, the regulation we've talked about, service provision, even planning is important here, fiscal measures. All of these have to ideally come together for a change to be effective and accepted by the people who are dealing with it.